Hey, I'm Paulina Nirmesita Pusparani. For me, falling in love is like matching the key. If they don't have the key, don't ever break door for them. Cause you will hurt yourself twice by letting them ruin your entire house. Love is two sides, namely good and bad. The two complement each other. Love makes us learn to understand situation and appreciate. Therefore, love can make us fail and sick. Once we feel it, but life becomes empty without love. I want to tell you a story about love. Man by nature is selfish creature. Even in his relationships with others, he tends to focus primarily on himself or at most on his self-colored perception of his fellow. Love is the endeavor to transcend this intrinsic selfishness and truly relate to one's fellow, to be sensitive to and devote to his or her needs as an individual distinct of oneself and one's own stake in the relationship. And yet, when the Torah speaks of the mitzvah to love your fellow as yourself, it does so in the context of man's duty to influence and even change the behavior and nature of his fellow man. In Leviticus, the Torah commands, "Don't hate your brother in your heart. Repeatedly rebuke your fellow and don't attribute sin to him. Don't take revenge or harbor hatred toward your people and love your fellow as yourself." As the commentaries explain, there are two possible reactions a person can have toward a fellow who has wronged him or whom he sees behaving in a morally deficient manner. First, he can despise him in his heart, regarding him as a sinner, and perhaps even persecute him for his sins. Second, he can rebuke him in the effort to convince him of the folly of his ways and seeks to influence him to change them. The path of love, says the Torah, is not to hate your brother in your heart, but to repeatedly rebuke him and seek to better him. Obviously, the desire to influence is consistent with the idea of love. No one would stand by as a loved one suffers hunger of his strength, not by violence, not less so if one sees someone he loves suffering from spiritual malnutrition or moral blindness. He will make every effort to reach out to him, to enlighten him, to offer quietness and assistance. But this aspect of loving behavior carries an inherent paradox. On the one hand, the endeavor to influence and change implies a departure from self and concern with the well-being on the other. On the other hand, it implies a seemingly selfish view of the other, a rejection of the other as he is, and a desire of impose one's own perception of what is good for him upon him. An exploration of the history of humanity as recounted in the Torah reveals four figures who personified four different points of reference of the relationship between self and fellow. Each of these individuals was considered the most righteous of his generation. Thus, their lives can be seen to reflect four stages in the spiritual development of humanity, four stages in the movement from an instinctive selfhood toward the complete abnegation of self and self-interest in relating to others. The first of these four outstanding individuals was Enoch, a great-great-great-great-grandson of Adam. By his name, humanity had abandoned of the one God of their fathers and had succumbed to idolatry and pagan perversity. Only Enoch still walked with God, but Enoch's righteousness was wholly self. He was preoccupied only with the refinement and perfection of his own spiritual self. Not only did Enoch fail to have a lasting impact on his society, but he was ultimately in danger of being influenced by their corrupt behavior. Several generations later, we encountered another righteous man in a corrupt generation, Noah, builder of an ark and regenerator of humanity after the flood. Noah's instruction to build an ark so that they may survive the flood. Our sages relate that Noah worked on the ark's construction a full of 120 years. All this time he called out to his generation to mend its ways and avoid catastrophe. However, the Zohar critiques Noah for the faith However, that Zohar critiques Noah for the fact that despite his efforts, he did not pray for the salvation of his generation, unlike Abraham and Moses, who pleaded with God to spare the weak. Noah's influence with others was limited to his sense of what he ought to do for them, as opposed to a true concern for their well-being. Himself had sufficiently broadened to include the imperative to act for the sake of another, recognition that the lack of a social conscience is a defect in one's own character. But he fell short of transcending that self to care for others beyond the consideration of his own righteousness. 10 generations later was born an individual who raised the concept of man's devotion to the welfare of his neighbor to selfless hate, Abraham the first Jew. He too faced a corrupt and pagan world. Indeed, his title, the Hebrew, is associated with the fact that the ancient world stood on one side and he stood on the other. The selflessness of Abraham's concern for his fellow is demonstrated by his daring intervention on behalf of the fire sinful cities of the Sodom Valley. Abraham's virtue over Noah was that his objective in relating to others lay not in realizing the potential of his social self, or as was the case with Noah, but in achieving the desired result to transform their behavior and character, bringing to light their good and perfect essence. But therein also lies the limitation of Abraham's love. Ultimately, Abraham's kindness had an ulterior motive. True, it was not a personal motive. True, it was a motive that spells the received ultimate good and is consistent with the received true self, but it was ulterior motive. Such love and concern for the sake of the potential good that one sees in another is a love that it tainted, however minutely, with selfishness. One is relating to one's fellow not as one's fellow sees himself, but with an else as to one's own vision on him. This allows for a reaction on his part that you don't care for me as I am, only for what you wish to make of me, so you don't really care about me at all. True, one's only desire is to reveal that other's essential self, but this is a deeper, still unrealized self. One's love fails to address that other as he knows expressly is focusing instead on one's knowledge of what he lately is and what he can ought to make on himself. In contrast, Moses' love for his people was utterly selfless. It was an unconditional love, one that is assuming of what they ought to be or what they are on a deeper yet unrealized level. He loved them as they were and did everything in his power to satisfy their needs, both material and spiritual. When Moses pleaded to God on behalf of the worshipper, the effects of Moses' utterly selfless love are internal. His quietness and leadership of his people yield a nation whose endurance and unbroken continuity to this very day. Davis allows of histories. Thank you.